tutorial is going to cover exceptions and assertions. Before we begin, make sure that you have Java and the Java JDK downloaded on your computer. You can check by running java-version in your terminal. Also make sure that you have the IntelliJ IDE downloaded on your computer. We're going to be using this for all of the code examples during this tutorial. And it's suggested that you watch the previous Java tutorials in the Lunch and Learn playlist. So we're going to start with exceptions. What is an exception? An exception occurs whenever a problem happens during the running of your code that the Java executor doesn't know how to handle. When an exception is thrown, your program will stop executing and show an error if it is not handled properly. So common exception types are a null pointer exception, an illegal argument exception, which is thrown by the programmer when a parameter isn't correct for some reason, an index out of bound exception, and that's thrown, for instance, if you try to get a char at in a string for an index that wasn't part of the string. So if your string was, say, 5 characters long and you tried to get char at 8, that's not a valid index, so you throw an index out of bounds exception. An arithmetic exception. This happens when bad math occurs, like dividing by 0. Handling an exception. When handling an exception, you can use a try-catch block to keep your program from grinding to a halt with an unhelpful message that should an error exception occur. You can have multiple catches for different types of exceptions, or just one catch for the exception class, which will catch all kinds of exceptions. So this works because exception is a superclass, and the other kinds of exceptions are children of that class. And we'll learn more about this behavior whenever we go over inheritance later in these tutorials. Exception methods. There's e.getMessage, which will get the message associated with the exception. There's e.getClass.toString, which will get the name of exception e that was thrown, for example, null pointer exception. And then there's e.toString, which will get all the information about the exception e, the name and the message, and so the name and the message will be concatenated with a colon. The try-catch code example. So here's an example of a try-catch. There's try, and then some code that might throw an exception. And then this is an example of catching a specific exception, which would be a null pointer exception. And so after you catch it, you would print a null pointer exception was thrown, and then you could print out in.toString, for example. And this will catch all other kinds of exceptions that happen. So system.out.println, an exception was thrown, and then this e.toString would give you more information about the exception, like the kind of exception that it was and the message associated with it. Throwing an exception. Sometimes it makes sense for you as a programmer to throw an exception yourself. For example, when a parameter doesn't follow the rules set forth for it by you, the programmer, and in that case you would throw an illegal argument exception. Throwing an exception code example. So here's an example of you throwing an exception. It would be throw new and then the exception type, and then in parentheses and in quotes the exception message. And you can exclude the exception message if you want to. You don't have to put it in there. It's just something that's more helpful, that gives more context and is helpful for the exception that's being thrown. So we're going to do an exception exercise now. Let's get this to be split screen with this. Okay. So we want to do a new Java, nope. We want to do new package, and we're going to call it exceptions and assertions. And then we want to do new Java class, exception exercise, and then double click to make that left pane go away. We want to put it in our main, public static void main, string args. Okay, so in this case, we want to throw one of each kind of exception. We want to do a null pointer exception an illegal argument exception, an index out of bounds exception, and an arithmetic exception. So I'm going to go ahead and put all of these. I'm going to do a method for each. So public static void throws null pointer. So I want to force this to throw a null pointer exception. I don't want to have to throw it myself. So I know that I can do that by doing string s equals null, and then doing s dot to uppercase. And it's giving me a warning that it may produce a null pointer exception. And I'm going to go ahead and leave it like that and put a try around it and do a catch null pointer exception e, and then system.out.println e.toString. Okay, so that will throw a null pointer exception, just like this warning is telling me that it might. And public static void throws illegal argument. So in this case, I'm going to do a try, and then a catch. And I'm going to catch the illegal argument exception, E. Okay, so I'm going to do throw new illegal argument exception, thrown intentionally. And here, I'm going to, again, just print out the error message, the exception message. And now I want to throw an index out of bounds exception on purpose, so public static void throws index out of bounds. Try. So I'm going to say that string s is equal to Jobby. And then I'm going to say s dot index and s dot char at, and the index I'm going to make 10. And I know that 10 is out of the range of Jobby, because Jobby is only 5 characters long, which means its valid indexes are from 0 to 4. So I'm going to do char c, and then a catch, and I'm going to catch index out of bounds exception. And again, I'm just going to print the toString for it. And finally, public static void throws arithmetic exception. So I'm going to do a try. I'm going to do int black hole equals 2 divided by 0. And here I get a warning about a numeric overflow and expression, because it knows that I can't divide by 0. But I'm going to catch arithmetic exception. And again, I'm just going to print out the toString. Okay, so now I want to call all these. Throws null pointer, throws illegal, throws index out of bounds, and throws arithmetic, which I think I did. Arithmetic. There we go. So now I want to do run, I want to do exception exercise, and so it's running the exception exercise. And there we go. It was able to run through with all the exceptions happening, and here is a printout of all of the toStrings for it. So the first one was just the null pointer exception. The second one was the illegal argument exception with my message, thrown intentionally. And then there was the out of bounds, and it tells me which index was out of bounds, string index out of range. And then the arithmetic exception tells me that the divide by 0 was the problem. And that's it for the exception exercise. Assertions. What is an assertion? An assertion is a declarative sentence that is either true or false. For example, 2 plus 2 is 4. When an assertion fails in Java, it throws an assertion error exception. Context and assertions. Sometimes assertions are true or false depending on the context. For example, it is raining is true sometimes and false others. So just keep that in mind as you're looking at different points in your code. At different points in your code, a certain assertion might be true or false. Some vocab. A provable assertion is an assertion that can be proven true at a particular point in a program's execution. A precondition is a statement or statements that is supposed to be true before a particular method is run. It can be checked using assertions. It can also be checked using a regular if statement and throwing exceptions explicitly. A postcondition is a statement or statements that is supposed to be true after a particular method is run, and it can be checked using assertions. Another use for assertions. Assertions are often used in unit tests, test cases for code that make sure it's working as expected. They are run whenever code changes to make sure that the core functionality hasn't changed or been broken. And we might look at some unit tests later in the tutorials. I haven't really decided yet, but unit tests are important whenever you're working with a large code base because it keeps the code correct as maybe multiple people change it over time. So this is an assertion code example. It's assert and then a Boolean statement and then a colon with a message for the failed assertion. So an assertion exercise is to take the receipt with methods Java class from the parameters return values in math methods tutorial and have a precondition for each method for the parameters to be both positive and less than 1,000. And for each assertion, make the failure message reflective of the method that the assertion is in. So I'm going to go double click here and go to parameters and copy, and then I'm going to paste. I'm going to say receipt with methods with preconditions. Double click. Okay. So I have print receipt, and I'm going to assert that subtotal is less than 1,000. And if it's not, I'm going to say subtotal and print receipt too big. And I'm going to put this in calculate total with tax as well, because it's just the same parameter basically. But I'm going to change it to be in calculate total with tax. And then I'm going to take this and put it here, except I'm going to change the subtotal to be total with tax. And then I'm going to change this to calculate total with tip. And that's it. Now I have 3 different assertions one that checks the subtotal on print receipt, one that checks the subtotal and calculate total with tax, and one that checks the subtotal and calculate total with tip. And that's it. Those are the 3 assertions that I need. And if I hit run, it still passes. Oh, I want to do run and nope, run and then run. And I want to do run and then run receipt with methods with preconditions. And it was able to run properly because all of my totals were below 1,000. But now I want to run it to where the assertion fails. In order to do that, I need to edit the configuration a little bit in IntelliJ. So I'm going to do open and do edit configurations. And where it says VM options, I'm going to do -EA for enable assertions. Apply. Okay. And now, if I change this to 1005 and do play, I see that I get the assertion error that I was expecting that says the subtotal and the print receipt is too big. And since that's exactly what I was expecting it to happen. So assertions are working just like I wanted. Now don't forget, you'll need to edit the configuration to have -EA and the VM options in order for assertions to work in IntelliJ. And if you're using a different kind of editor, you'll have to figure out how to enable assertions for that editor as well. So assertions always have to be enabled, or they won't actually be checked. So the practice for later is to change the rock, paper, scissors code from the previous tutorial's practice to include 2 preconditions. Player 1's move must equal rock, paper, or scissors, and player 2's move must equal rock, paper, or scissors. Include 2 calls to the game method that make each precondition fail. There should be a try-catch around each bad call that deals with the exception appropriately. And that's it. I hope that was helpful.